Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com with another episode of my podcast, which has lots of names. So if you go to whatever podcatcher you want and look up my name, you will find a podcast where you can listen to this episode, or on YouTube, or on Facebook. But bottom line, this is going to be another episode just kind of talking about everything that's kind of going on in the world, because a lot has happened this week. So first I'm going to start off with some of the issues regarding the LGBT community or the GSM community. So if you're not aware, there's sort of like a second term that's supposed to be sort of like a broader term called gender sexual minority. So some people identify as LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, or LGBTQIA, but then there I start forgetting what the other letters stand for. So I think it's LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, I want to say intersex, asexual, but I'm not sure. And then GSM stands for gender sexual minorities, which I think also like includes like certain kinks and polygamy and polyamory in that category. So the idea is a sort of broader term for any kind of gender related or sexual related minority. Okay, so bottom line is that this week the Supreme Court made a decision, and it's actually, I think, a very interesting decision for sort of like how they came to it, with a very interesting logic that has interesting implications. But basically the idea was that there's a law that says you can't discriminate as far as employment goes. So an employer can't be like, I'm going to fire you because you're a particular race or you're a particular gender. And it's been treated that sort of, the question was, does that protect people based on their sexuality or based on their gender identity? Okay, because the way it's worded, it says you can't discriminate people based on sex. And it ended up passing, I think it was like 6 to the rest of the Supreme Court. And the big surprise was that Neil Gorsuch, a conservative justice, one of the ones appointed by Trump, sided with the majority and wrote the majority opinion, where he described the logic. And the funny thing is that he arrives with the logic through strict construction, because that's sort of Neil Gorsuch's thing. He's a strict constructionist. So to him, it's about... So the difference is, like, a strict constructionist takes into consideration sort of what the text says. What the text says is what the text says. Okay? It's not about what the intent is. It's not about necessarily original intent. It's not about sort of what the norms are today and trying to... It's... Does it say something, and does the application stick with what it says? And basically the argument is, okay, this says that you cannot discriminate based on sex, as in sort of your biological sex, male or female. So to the extent that that is in both these situations, whether you're a trans person or a gay person or lesbian, what you're doing is that if you're saying you can't discriminate someone for being gay, what you're doing is you're discriminating against the activity of them that you would allow someone of a different sex to have. So, for example, if I say, okay, I'm going to fire you because you're a man having sex with a man, but you wouldn't fire a woman for having sex with a man, then you technically are discriminating based on sex, because they are doing something that you would think is okay if someone of a different biological sex did it. So you're discriminating based on their biological sex. So it falls under that. Can't discriminate based on sex. Same thing with transgendered. So if I fire a man for dressing or for identifying and presenting themselves as female, while I would not fire someone who's biologically a female for identifying and presenting themselves as female, then technically I am discriminating. I'm saying it's okay for someone of this gender to do this and not of that gender, so I am discriminating you based on your sex, your biological sex. So it just comes back to sex, because you're saying you're basically discriminating based on, you're saying this would have been okay if their biological sex was different. So you're discriminating based on their biological sex. So they said, based on that, based on the law that has been written, then yes, this law does protect people who are homosexual, people who are transgendered. It does protect those people, it gives them the same protections that it gives a woman or a man, based on the idea of them being discriminated based on being a woman or a man. Okay? So I think that was actually a really interesting read and a really interesting, as it's sort of like, I like to consider myself somewhat sort of intellectual, so I always like seeing sort of arguments that didn't necessarily like come to mind, like wouldn't be the things that would have come to my mind first, but are actually compelling and persuasive. And I think that argument is actually a good way of sort of thinking about it. So the idea is, but this then, comes back down to, it comes down to sort of other things, in the sense that this logic can then end up extending to sort of the other qualities like race and religion, where, what if you fire someone for an activity that you wouldn't fire of someone of one religion, but you do fire someone of another religion, or same thing, someone of one race versus another race. So it's not necessarily, again, it's based on the activity, the combination of their race with an activity, or the combination of a religion with an activity. With that, I mean, logically, that would have the same protection. And now there's definitely the jurisprudence to protect them based on that. But it's just, again, I just find that very interesting, and it kind of tickles the brain and wants me to kind of think of scenarios, edge cases per se, because that's just kind of naturally what I'll do. Okay, so I thought that was a positive thing. And then at the same time, you also had Trump basically taking out sort of the protections that were built into the Affordable Care Act for transgender, basically saying that, and basically the idea was just, they're saying that, okay, it's okay for healthcare providers to deny sort of certain services that would sort of be for transgendered people and whatnot, like, sexual reassignment surgery and whatnot. I think, and then I issued a statement sort of against that, because, I mean, again, when you go to the text of it, it's not saying, okay, healthcare providers can discriminate. It's saying healthcare providers who are subsidized through the Affordable Care Act. And I do feel like if you are taking my money, because I'm a taxpayer, and these are not necessarily pure market entities, these are entities who are taking my money that I paid into the big pool of tax money, and they're making decisions on it. So they should be held to a higher standard. And if you don't want to be held to a higher standard, or you want to be held to a different standard, then you should go operate in a actual free market. Okay, in a free market, you can be who you want to be. Okay, and think what you want to think, because you are not forcing anybody else to have to fund your mistakes or your bad decisions or your beliefs. It's on you. But the minute you are subsidized by government, and then honestly, I'm fine with putting strings on companies who decide to take subsidies, because the more strings there are, the less companies will want to take subsidies. So one, I think it's valuable to the sense that we should hold that, to the extent that the government attaches strings to funds, attaching strings to making sure that those institutions that take those funds do a good job of creating a culture where we're sort of it's inclusive. I think that's fair. I think it's a fair string. Again, I don't think that string should be extended to people who don't take government funds. But I definitely think it should come with government funds, and I think those strings, to remove those protections, basically a lot of times cultures can it's a two-way feedback. Culture comes up from bottom up and top down. It's constant feedback loop. But basically what you're communicating is that the people in charge don't care about these people. It does say something, okay? And I do think there's a value in that, and it does bother me, especially with the timing. I mean, if I wanted to be less cynical about it, you could probably dismiss it saying, hey, they knew the Supreme Court decision was going to go this way, so it didn't seem necessary to have this piece here. But it's probably not that. More than likely, it was just a dollar and cents decision where they're like, okay, well, these procedures cost a lot of money. We don't want to be paying healthcare insurance companies because they pay them for like their losses this much, so this will reduce the cost. But at the same time, again, you're basically saying that you're disenfranchising people, saying, okay, well, we expect you to pay your taxes, but we're not going to offer you the same consideration we offer other people, even though you do pay your taxes. Okay, and that's troubling. That's troubling. I'd rather just, hey, how would we just get the government out of everything, and then no one has to fight on any of these lines. Okay, and then we can just purely have a discussion over who we are as individuals and how we're going to, whether we should, which I think we should, tolerate each other, forgive each other, embrace each other, and having a very inclusive culture built on cooperation and the cooperation that competition brings, and have that discussion. But the minute government's going to start taking my money and doling it out to others, I'm fine with them holding people to a higher standard. Okay, so there's that. So that's that discussion. Then there's a discussion about qualified immunity. So again, this week is also Juneteenth. I'm not an expert. So I apologize if I don't describe this accurately. But from my understanding, that Juneteenth is sort of a celebration of sort of setting the day that the final sort of slaves were set free. We're basically, you truly had sort of independence of the black community in America, where basically no black person anywhere was no longer a slave. And so basically it's a Black Independence Day. And I think that's nice. I think that's a beautiful sentiment. Basically we're not truly free till we're all free. I think that's a good way to think about things. And I think in general as individuals, when we sit there and we take a look at the world and we see places in the world that aren't free, I'm not saying we should go in there and intervene. Okay, I'm a non-interventionist. But we should care that there's places in the world where people aren't free, because there is a loss. There is something that we lose when somebody else isn't free, because it's another person who's, from an economic point of view, not part of the market. They're not a consumer. They're not a producer. They are, they're not contributing what they could be contributing. But also from a social side, there's someone who's not my friend, who's not someone who someone might have a meaningful relationship with, someone who's someone's family. So I like that sentiment of, we're not free until all of us are free. So I do kind of really appreciate that. But in that discussion, again, this all parlays with the discussion of sort of justice reforms that are sort of in the center of everything nowadays, and particularly qualified immunity. And again, I talked a little bit about qualified immunity in the last episode. But I mean, this is part of sort of a trend in public sector work in general. So the idea is that, bottom line is that government just doesn't have the money. And I mean, you could tax people a whole lot more and it still just wouldn't have the money to pay all of its public sector workers much more than it pays now, or basically have wages keep up with the same rate that they would necessarily go in the private markets. Okay, because they don't necessarily have increasing funds in the same way. And nor do they have like the labor flexibility. Like, there's just certain things that are just, a lot of things in the public sector are rigid, as far as like you can hire people, but it's really hard to fire them. Okay, and all these things. So you don't see, it's not just qualified immunity, but it's also like tenure and lots of other things. These are things that what we do is we say, hey, we're not going to pay you as much as you think you may want to be paid. So what we're going to offer you in exchange is these offsets, and these offsets of a certainty. So basically saying, hey, teacher, you can't get fired. Hey, police officer, you make some mistakes, you're not going to be held to the same standard that other people are held to. Okay, and then there's essentially, there is a benefit to that. There's a certain level of certainty to that makes the job more appealing. And also makes the lack of compensation, a little bit more palpable. The problem is, on the margins, and again, when I say some things at the margins, the idea is that it changes incentives a little bit. And it may not, it's not like someone goes from, oh, okay, hey, you gave me qualified immunity or you gave me tenure and now I'm just going to do my job a lot less good. That's not how it works. But again, it does change the calculation. So with certain decisions, you might, as far as maybe how you will behave in certain situations or what decisions you'll make regarding trade-offs and different things becomes different, because the trade-offs are different. The risk you have in doing X is no longer the same amount of risk, so the chances that you may choose Y becomes greater. And that does have an effect, okay, in the sense that if I'm a teacher who can't get fired and I'm really tired, and you know what, I'm just going to give everyone an A, or I'm just going to teach whatever I want, I don't care if the kids really understand it well. Usually without tenure, the risk is, okay, well, if I don't perform, if I don't educate these kids, if I indulge myself too much, I might not have a job. So there's this trade-off that's part of your calculation. It's no longer part of your calculation. It doesn't mean necessarily they don't want to educate. It doesn't necessarily mean they're not working hard. But sort of certain decisions they make in that process, they change on the margins. So it means not every decision changes, but some decisions change. Same thing for a police officer. Okay, if I know, okay, well, I might be tried if I'm too quick to shoot. And again, you do, at the end of the day, there's also the other overriding issue of, hey, my life. If you're actually sincerely worried about your life, that's probably going to be an overriding incentive. But, sometimes policing harder may seem, again, a better choice than why, because the offsets, the risks that were inherent in policing harder are not as much there. And again, doesn't mean you're going to make that decision every time, but on the margins, on those decisions where maybe you were on the fence, you've now changed which decision gets made. Okay, so on the decision, so these offsets, because the government can't pay people more. Again, government has limitations, and the problem is that as it gets money, it decides to hire more people instead of paying more to the people it has, and then but again, you can't really fire those people, and so you have some areas that are understaffed because other areas are overstaffed, and we can't release these funds over here. So you have places where people are sometimes not working enough, but other places where people are working too much and they're overworked and underpaid. And the problem is there's just not the kind of flexibility in government, in the public sector, to handle those things, which is why generally you don't want the government to administer things. Okay, even a lot of people who are for government running things, they're for, let's say, public-private partnerships where you hire independent entities. This is where some people who like charter schools, where they still want the government to fund schools, but they rather use it through other entities to have a little bit more flexibility in labor discussions and flexibility in their costs and contracts, so that way they can hopefully, possibly make better use of the funds. Doesn't mean it works out better every time. That's why I think sometimes people are unfair to charter schools, because every charter school is kind of a unique situation. So it's kind of the point. It's like, private businesses that do really well, but a lot of them, not all of them do. It's kind of the same idea. But even then, you still have the politics of the funding, and then who does the government select to be the partners? Oftentimes are the friends of the politicians, and then they basically use those to pay out the favors to the people who have the influence to get them elected. And it's still, and then you don't have as much competition. The competitions would put some pressure for other optimizations and improvements. So still, even then, may be a little bit better, but still there's problems. But again, when it's just like government doing it, not just funding it, but administering it, it's oftentimes pretty bad. Okay? Compare to the outcomes with Medicare, Medicaid versus the VA in some cases. And you hear veterans with nightmare stories where they're waiting 8 months for an appointment and all sorts of really, really scary things versus, Medicare and Medicaid, where just funding the healthcare services. They're not providing the healthcare services. While they are huge spending and more spending than the government can really afford, people can get an appointment more often than not. And, shades of gray and there's differences between Medicare and Medicaid and whatnot. So, point is, when it comes to public sector workers, it's hard to kind of give them the right incentives. So then you have to sort of rethink, do we really want that much administered publicly? Okay, not the funding question we can have as a separate discussion. Okay, we want to separate some people might think certain things should be publicly funded, but should they be publicly administered? Is that really, really a good idea? Even law enforcement, maybe even the courts. Okay, how often do we see backlogs in courts? And because of this, we short-circuit laws. We short-circuit justice because we create arbitrary sort of statute of limitations and whatnot because the court backlogs are so low. But sometimes now some people will never get to see justice, and then a lot of times they get filled up with frivolous lawsuits and they can't. It's just all these things that in another context, in a context that's more flexible, which are generally private markets based on consent and whatnot, where we can kind of figure those things out and change them much quicker to figure out what's sort of the right mix. Doesn't mean it's going to work out perfectly right away, but as you figure out what doesn't work, you can quickly change it. Versus government, when you figure something out that doesn't work, it might take you another decade before you fix it. It's a different context, and you don't waste as much resources over time. So these are sort of some of the considerations. So when I say let's talk about qualified immunity, I mean, it is part of a larger trend with just sort of how the public sector labor market works. So hopefully